Everybody, please watch this video. The one we're about to do right now is going to be part 2 of this one. Thank you. Hope you learn and understand what I'm trying to say. Thank you for watching. Alright guys, thanks for tuning in. Just bear with me. It's just a couple little short segments. It's less than like a minute and a half long. And then we'll get started. Thanks.
3000, 6500 cam. What kind of cam profiles do turbos really like compared to a supercharger cam profile? They like the same ones or they like different ones. It's not what the turbo likes, it's not what the blower likes. It's what the owner of the engine likes.
There you go.
Here are the best camshaft with the 106.
Look what it does here though. With each step of wider lobe sep, it starts to carry a little bit better up here where we're not using it. Why did it?
Because when I originally built this engine 20 years ago, the lobe step I went with was 107.
Yeah.
Because I knew it was a production-based cylinder head, and it's a small cross-sectional area, so it's airflow limited at that displacement. Now, if I was doing a 383 with the same head,
Yeah.
it might want to go a little bit wider and still be and run out the back door at a higher RPM.
Because of the RPM capability.
Yeah, the airflow to displacement, basically.
Okay.
So
I remember about 100 years ago, I remember a 360 cubic inch sprint car guy saying he was putting a 106 lobe sep cam and that should help it out of the corners. And I just didn't grasp it.
right.
This sure helps. This
Yeah.
is real.
Here and welcome back to the second part of my camshaft LSA intake center line video. I hope you have watched video, the first one I did, and in this video I'm going to show you a lot of examples. I'm going to be talking in ways that you may have to re-watch this thing a couple times to grasp it, and I think it's going to be very informative as to what all takes place when you design an engine to race, and the particular type of racing it is, the types of tracks there is, the engine you're doing this for. Cam design is, I cannot stress to you how critical it is. And it's what has really set us apart from the others with our success. And very easy to prove. So I hope you learn a lot from this, and stay tuned. Okay, so I want to start out with a couple of things it's important for you to consider. A lot of people, not a lot of people, but there are people out there that are doing a lot of R&D. They're doing a lot of testing using hydraulics, and in my experience, and again that's quite a bit, they're trying to gather information doing hydraulic test and apply it to the camshaft world, and guys, you can't do that. The true effect that a cam has on an engine, you will really truly only find, let me make sure I say this correctly. In other words, if I want to know for an engine combination, whether it's, you know, a size of the engine, the bore, the stroke, compression ratio, the induction system, the exhaust system, which is a big deal. Okay, if I want to know what cam I should use, and I'm doing test, you have to understand that hydraulics can fool you. And what happens is you get these problems with hydraulics. In other words, I may have a solid cam profile that makes gobs of power, will turn till the rods come out the side, RPM, you know, well, 10,000 RPM, makes a ton of power, does everything I want it to do, and then I put that same profile on a hydraulic and I'm down 150 horsepower, it won't rev. Why? Because it's hydraulic. And what happens is, and this is not in every case, but it's in a lot of cases, what happens is the hydraulic part, you have to run in order to turn RPMs. And remember, this video is based on high performance in racing and what makes us successful. I'm trying to make you successful. Remember, with hydraulic, I mean, with any engine, you have to have some decent spring pressure depending on the weight of the valve train to RPM. So if I apply that same solid camshaft combination to a hydraulic lifter, what winds up happening is I start pushing this plunger down. This thing, the cam lobe can be really aggressive and starts to raise it very rapidly. And what's it fighting against? Well, it's fighting against the valve spring and also cylinder pressure on the exhaust side. And what happens? I depress this plunger. Well, when I depress this plunger, what's coming out of the side? Oil. What is that doing to my at valve cam numbers? Okay. In other words, this cam may be 250 degrees duration, but because my lifter is bleeding down, it's not seeing but 220 at the valve. You follow me? It might be 750 lift, but it's not seeing but 600 lift at the valve. It might supposed to open and close at these numbers, but it's not because of the plunger bleeding down. They also aerate really bad. So you will find that a softer lobe, when I say softer, what I mean is gently applying pressure to the lifter at the beginning and then bringing it up and then setting it down gently. Man, guys, there's so much technology in that right there. Will be better for you than something I'm doing with solids that will just knock the oil out of this thing. So if I'm basing all of my cam knowledge on hydraulics, I am going to be left behind on the racetrack. And that's just a fact. And that's if you're running against high RPM or, you know, solid stuff. Hydraulics have their place. And if you do a light enough valve train, you can make them do some pretty crazy things. You can make them do pretty cool things. But I like the security of solid. Everything I do is solid. I mean, not everything I do, but my racing world is mostly solid. And 9,000 RPMs is nothing. Now, I hear people loosely throw the term around, oh, we turn 10,000 RPMs. And then you see they're running a 900 base circle cam. I'd like to see that. I mean, I'm not saying it can't be done, because it can be done, but people throw terms around very loosely. Now, we turn 88, 8900 regularly, and I don't necessarily like it, but you know, whatever. You know why the guy does it? The one particular guy, he says, well, Salter, I can't help it, man. The engine feels like it doesn't want to stop pulling, so I'm putting gear to it. And he's like, it pulls from the time I come out around the corner to the time I let out of it, it doesn't stop pulling. Now that is when you know you've done your homework. So that's what I'm trying to help you figure out, is how do you get a cam to do that? So many times, what I see is people will make a drag racing cam, 1/8 mile, 1/4 mile, circle track cams, and a lot of these guys have not had the experience I have being in a higher echelon of racing. They don't put engines out every week. They're not there, so they don't have the experience. And what I see is I'll get engines come in from other places, and I'll ask the guy, you know, tell me about this engine. What kind of personality does it have? Because the engine has a personality. And they'll say, oh man, you know, it's really strong off the corner. Hear that a lot. But then, you know, before you get midway down the straightaway, you feel like it just kind of is flat. Hear that a lot. Or I'll hear it's the dog off the turn and it doesn't really try and run until you pass the flag stand. And guys, some of these tracks that we build for are very big. You know, 150, 170 mile an hour straightaways and stuff. And I hear that a lot. So, but I hear the first one more, the coming off the corner and then nosing over. I hear that one a lot. Same thing in the drag racing world. When we won all those racing events with Ricky Greer, we won Pinks All Out, we've won nationals, foot brake nationals, the world records we've set with the land speed racing. All of that was a particular cam that I designed to do a particular job. And the biggest, if I could say, the biggest thing I get from the driver is the difference in the power band of the engines. They all tell me, man, this thing freaking pulls from the time you get out of the turn to you let out of it. And what a compliment, right? That's my goal. So there are really good benefits to that. Now, you've heard me use the term I tune with LSA, and I do. And guys that are, you know, there are people who like, LSA is this, that, and the other, it's not an input or whatever, and that's fine. I mean, that's their beliefs, but it is an input for me. And the reason being is because I can change the profile of the engine. I can change the personality of the engine with my lobe separation angle. I'm gonna show you that today. So I'm taking the time to make this video. It has taken me a while to get this together because of all the stuff going on with just being busy with my dad and life. So tried really hard to get this together. But what I wanted you to understand was, do not try to apply concrete evidence based off of hydraulics, because you're going to be left in the dust. And if you're one of those guys that does tons of hydraulic R&D, that's great, but don't apply it to solids. You're going to be left behind, like I said. Solids are unique, and they are true. I mean, it is what it is. If the engine runs great. If it don't, it don't. And with hydraulics, there can be so many variables that I've actually seen where you've got you've got the right cam, but you've got an oil flow issue, or you've got a piece of junk lifter, or you just need a different spring to have pressure in a different location. A lot of guys, and what I mean is, you can have a ton of seat pressure that causes a lot of plunger pressure early, or you can have a lot of valve pressure later in the open cycle. Excuse me, guys. So that maybe it's light on the beginning and increases as the lift carries on. So there's lots of ways to skin that cat, and that will affect your lifter bleed down drastically. So again, I just, personally, I don't apply anything I've learned, or not necessarily anything. I don't apply everything I've learned with hydraulics to solids. And I cannot apply everything with solids to hydraulics. Please understand that. Don't make that mistake. And that has nothing to do with necessarily LSA and intake center line. That has something to do with my springs and my lobe profile. Okay. Now, why did I bring that up? Because my lobe profile dictates where I'm going to wind up with my lobe separation angle and my intake center line. And what I want the engine to do, the personality it has, will dictate where I put my LSA. Okay, and I'm going to prove that to you here shortly. So remember that key point. Okay. All right. Hang tight. All right, so let's take a quick review here. And some of you may know this, some of you may not. So I thought, well, it'd be good for you to know what happens when you advance a camshaft, okay? And these are basic. These are very basic. Advancing the camshaft intake center line. So we're talking about not the lobe separation angle, but the actual camshaft. And I'll give you an example. If the lobe separation angle was was ground at 110, then advancing it would be anything before 110, such as 109, 108, 107.6, on and on. Now, I'm going to give you a rule of thumb here. Okay? Never advance, I'll put it like this so it doesn't go out of the picture, more than 6 degrees. Okay? Maybe the brackets are stupid. Let me get rid of those. Alright, so never advance your camshaft more than 6 degrees. Now I know right now some of you are going, well, why not? And that's a great question to ask because it's fair. Why not? Why shouldn't you advance more than 6 degrees? And basically, here's the thing. The more power you make, the more BTUs the engine produces, right? The more heat energy it makes. And if an engine is properly tuned, and when I say that, I don't mean just air-fuel ratio and spark timing. I also mean intake and exhaust opening and closing, the timing part of it. The entire engine, if it is properly tuned, it will not overheat. Okay? And now, obviously, if you have too small a radiator or something like that, no airflow, you know, you can have problems. But I'm talking about, you see guys that they have the same racing cooling system as anyone else, and yet their engine seems to overheat constantly. And almost 100% of the time when they call me, it's a tuning problem. The cam's in there out of whack, the timing's out of whack, the valve adjustment's out of whack, something is way out of whack. But when that engine is firing properly, cylinder pressures are correct, valve timing is correct, it doesn't overheat. So a lot of times when you go past 6 degrees, you're going to run into that problem. And the same for retarding it. Okay? And one of the things that got a lot of the circle track guys ran into probably 15, 20 years ago was when they first came out with traction control. The boxes that I saw guys trying to run traction control, and they would tell me that, man, when I turn this traction control on, my engine overheats. And the reason being is the traction control, when I was like, okay, let me figure this out. So I put a timing light on it. And by the way, I don't promote that. Okay, this is stuff they would do on their own. They were blowing the tires off the car, so they buy traction control. And then the funny part is they want more horsepower. So, you know, they're already blowing the tires off, but they get traction, and oh man, by the way, this is just gonna put the nail in it as to why I tune with a camshaft, okay? But they get traction control, And you know what it was doing? Retarding the timing sometimes 12 and 15 degrees back. Now you imagine an engine that wants 34 degrees of timing, let's say, and you put a timing light on it when the traction control kicks in and it's down to 20 degrees and you're on a tight track or something and it's constantly kicking in and you're running that engine at 20 degrees of timing when it should be 34, and they wonder why their engine temp is going 250 and 260, and you're lighting the fuel when it's in the exhaust pipe. I mean, it is a problem. So that's another reason. I could chase a lot of rabbits, guys. You got a lot of years of experience here trying to help you. So try and follow me as best you can. Just never do that. If you want to do it on your own just to spite me, then you go right ahead. But if you're having to do that, there's something wrong with your camshaft. You got the wrong cam. All right. And also we're going to talk about what advancing does to your power band. I'm going to explain to you here in a moment why I don't hardly ever do it. So it begins the advance sooner. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because you've advanced the cam. In relation to what? What does that mean, I've advanced it? When we install a camshaft and we degree it in with a degree wheel, we're degreeing it in based off of top dead center on the engine. Where's that number one piston in relationship to my camshaft valve timing events? That's what we're talking about. So if the cam was ground on 110 lobe separation angle, then perfect zero would be intake center line of 110 intake center line. If it's on 108, it's advanced 2 degrees. If it's on 106, it's advanced 4 degrees. You understand, right? If it's on 112, it's retarded 2 degrees. Okay? So it begins the event sooner. It opens the intake valve sooner. It provides a little earlier torque curve. Okay? Now, on one of the websites, Comp put that it provides more torque. And I'm going to slightly disagree with that. It provides a little earlier torque, decreases intake valve clearance. Why? Because you're opening the valve sooner as the piston is coming up. And remember, this is, racing stuff. A lot of the street engines would never have an issue because they're not lifting the valve far enough, or the valve timing is just not, in the way of the piston. So it will, it decreases your intake valve clearance and it increases your exhaust piston to valve clearance. So because it starts sooner, the exhaust is already, starting to close as the piston's coming up a little earlier. So you get a little more exhaust clearance that way. All right, now let's look at the retarding the camshaft. Okay, so retarding the intake center line, well, obviously it's going to delay the intake closing because it's going to open the intake a little later. It can build more high RPM power. It increases your intake valve clearance and it decreases your exhaust valve clearance. All right, so those are just the basic things of intake center line and how advancing or retarding them affects the engine. Now, if I can get you to understand that a straight cam, right, like this one, like once we make it, LSA is fixed. Yes, I have some phenomenal machinists that can move it almost a degree depending on the lobe profile and how big and small the lobes are. But normally speaking, it's locked in once it's made. But I want you to think about something. If the LSA is on 110 and I advance the cam, say 4 degrees, and all those things with advancing the cam takes place that I mentioned earlier, okay, such as a little more acceleration, a little more lower end torque, and of course the valve clearance issues, would it not make sense that if we move the LSA to 106, that the same might apply? Except for the fact you also have the exhaust that comes into play too. Well, I want you to just think about that a moment. And if retarding the cam, let's say it's on 110 and I put it to 112, what does that do for it? Gives it a little more high RPM power, or at least it can do that. Does it not make sense that if I move my intake, if I move my LSA to 112, that the same will apply? See, if I retard a cam if I retard a camshaft that's ground on 110 and I retard it to 112, I'm going to lose torque on the bottom, and I could possibly gain high RPM power out of it by retarding it 2 degrees. Well, does it stand a reason that if I grind the current cam on 112, the same will apply? Interesting fact, isn't it? Interesting point I'm making. Very interesting point I'm making here. Now, so many times what you will see is on YouTube, you'll see a lot of people that are doing these tests. And by the way, I commend them because, man, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to do it just for, say, a video. And you'll see them make these cam tests. And I'm just going to draw a few here. Boy, that's not how it goes. Sorry. But let's say this is our power curve, and let's see, like this. There we go. And you'll start seeing stuff like this. Everybody, does this look familiar to anybody? And you look and you've got maybe 104, 106, 108, 112. Here's your 112, here's your 108, here's your 106, and your 104 is kind of tucked in there somewhere. And can you see that? Let me look here. Just slide that over just a hair bit. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. You say, well, what's your point? My point is, whether anybody wants to admit it or not, given the same cam duration, and we'll just put the intake would be, let's say, 220 and 276. I'm just making up numbers. And the exhaust is 226 and 284 with, I don't know, 500 lift and 525 or something. Okay? So there's your at 50, there's your advertised, and there's your at 50, and so on. Okay? All four of those cams got the same numbers. Only difference is the spread between the intake and exhaust lobes. And this is what you're going to see. And it's not fairy tale. It's not guessing. It is what you see. And every YouTube video that has done this, this is what you see. Am I wrong or right? Well, you know I'm right. You say, well, how can you prove that? Well, Engine Masters did a bunch of them showing it. My mind here is going blank for a second. Richard Holdner did a really good video on this very thing. Billy Godbold talks about this very thing. David Vizard talks about this very thing. I talk about this very thing. And this is what we really see. But here's the problem with all the videos that you've watched. If you notice, when you look at the dyno graft, where does it all seem to stop, guys? And I'm just going to say, on average, this is where they stop at. Y'all see that? You'll notice that they all stop about 6,500. You said, well, what does that mean? Well, 98% of the racing engines that I build are just getting started here. And this is where the lack of experience from some of these people, and, well, that's basically it. It's just lack of experience. This is where there's a dividing line. And I'm going to show you right now what truly happens. This is what you're going to see. If you were to carry that out, let's say to where we race at a lot of times, where we're at 8,500, okay? We're now at 8,500. This is what you would start to see. Okay? 112, 108, 106, 104. You start seeing a drastic change in what really happens when you get up there in the RPM range. Now, granted, this is just a drawn graph, but this is what happens. You say, well, how do you know? Because I've been building engines for 30 years and racing, and I know. Now, for every one of these things, the other problem is, and I need you to hear me here, is they're all done with the same intake and exhaust cam lobe. And guys, in reality, that's not how it's done. I mean, that's a fair test. I'm not saying their test isn't right. What I'm saying is, in reality, the guys like me, the pro engine builders who are doing this for a living, we don't do this. Why? Because when I change these numbers are changed as well. That is what actually happens. In one of my first videos I ever made, I said I do use LSA, and this was just talk, like I was just making a video. I hadn't watched YouTube, I hadn't watched anybody's videos, I had no idea what was out there. I was just talking about how I do things, and I said I do use LSA as an input as one of my first choices. And maybe that verbiage is a little misleading, because in reality I do use LSA as an input because of my job. It is my job to build an engine to win a race. It is not my job to build an engine to win a dyno competition. Do you follow what I'm saying? In other words, just like earlier, where I said I would build, these guys would buy race engines from anybody, and the first thing they do is go buy traction control. What does traction control do? Traction control would pick up tire spin and retard the timing. And now they're fighting over heating issues because the people who made the traction control are not engine builders, and they're backing the timing down 12 and 15 degrees of timing. So it was overheating the engines. And so they had to be called on the phone and say, hey dude, you're going to have to, this needs to be readjusted. So they put a little rheostat or variable resistor or something in there where you could make it where it only went back to like, 4 or 6 degrees or so, 4 or 6 degrees. And the guy's just going to have to learn how to drive a race car with his right foot like the old timers used to. Junior Miller used to tell me, I got traction control, it's called a right foot. And I won a lot of races with that dude. National championship, guys. Okay? I was so proud of that. National championship. Yeah, I'm happy. I'm bragging about it because obviously he drove the car and everything had to be right. But before you can finish first, you must first finish. That engine powered him multiple 2 engines we did for the year. You have the main and the backup. And 1 engine, we didn't use the backup. I don't remember how many races, like 20 races, 20 some races. We do change valve springs every so many laps because the cams that I would do are violent. So as long as you keep your valve springs cooled and changed, the engine was perfect. Look, that carried him through all them races, and he was able to win so many of them. Set actually a track record that year and won the national championship. Okay? So I know what I'm talking about now. Getting back to this, how do you tune with LSA? Because you see what's happening here? I can control and change the personality of that engine based on my lobe separation angle. Look at what's happening. Now this can't be argued with anybody because this is reality. And what happens is, let's say that this one here, these numbers are on, I don't know. Let's say that's the 104, okay? And then the 112, we're going to make it I'm just throwing numbers out, right? We're going to make it a 216, 270, and 220, I don't know, 280 on the 112. So what are you doing? The lobe and the numbers go together with the lobe separation angle, guys. Now, here's what I've said before, and that is this. You can take, and I've said it a bunch of times, you can take, I can get a cam made from comp, a cam made from competitor A, competitor B, competitor C, and I'll say the closest thing I can find to make them all the same is I want this lobe and this exhaust lobe on this LSA, and they're all equally as close as they can possibly be, and there will be 30 horsepower between the best and the worst. You say, how's that possible? Because of this right here. Okay? This is the imaginary base circle here. Oops. Sorry about my not so round circle. Well, remember that flat line we did in the first video? Here's that flat line. What happens between here and here? What happens between there and there? And there and there and there and there? And what happens between there and there and there and there and there and there? You said, man, you're crazy, Salter. Yes, I know. But here's the deal. The 50 and the, 100 and the 200 and the 300 and the whatever it is, right? 450 or something lobe lift. What do you mean what happens? What happens is how that lifter climbs that lobe is what I mean. If this thing is a flat wall at the beginning of the opening, right? It's boom! It's hitting it like a truck. And I'm actually, the lobes are so aggressive, it's like side loading the body of the lifter. Okay? And it may open my valve stupid fast, and I might make torque beyond comprehension and just be blown away with the performance, but how long is it going to last? What's coming out the top of the valve cover, or this wheel comes off and these two little pieces here jam into the cam and stop it dead in its tracks. Rip all the teeth off your belt drive. Bend every valve in the engine at 8,800 RPMs, and those things are $220 a piece. And you bust the pistons and possibly bend rods and crack your block. And now you've got a $50,000 boat anchor. All because of what happens right here. And what happens right here dictates my lobe separation angle. You said, what are you talking about? How does it dictate your lobe separation angle? Because it is the opening and closing event of that valve. You have people that say it's not an input. And then they finish the sentence with, it's only used to control where you open and close the valve. Well, what in the world is double talk is that? That makes it an input. But even beyond that, I don't care. I'm going to control the personality of my engine with it. He said, what do you mean? What if I make the cam where it is the traction control? How nice is it for a driver to be able to flat foot it coming off the turn and it not blow the tires off, but yet just as soon as the car is back square on the ground, because right in a turn, the chassis is, you can't have the chassis upset or you're not going to make the turn. You're going to lose control. Not lose control, but you're going to start spinning. And when you're spinning, your laptops are slower. If I make the camshaft to where it is the traction control, then all of a sudden now the car settles down, and by the time it settles down, that thing starts to wake up and you blow by people. I do it every week. Now it would be a little bit of an effort for me, but don't make me get 100 videos of people saying that that's exactly what my engine does, and it didn't do that until we got the stuff from him. Because I can do that. But that wouldn't get me hardly any views, and what's the point, right? I want you to do this and just listen to what I'm saying, and I want you to think about it. If advancing and retarding has the same similar effect, not as drastic though, not near as drastic, but when you advance the cam, you do build a little more pressure down low, and you have a little, possibly more torque, and earlier torque for sure. And when you retard a cam, you get a little more top end. It is a glimpse. That's what that is. It is a glimpse into the world of what lobe separation angle does. Because, okay, you guys can tell I'm passionate about this, right? Okay, so look, I told you it's very easy to say, well, this is what LSA is, this is what intake centerline is, and that's what it is, and then stop, right? It's difficult to get somebody to see the effects of it and what it does. Now, let's watch this a moment. So, let's say that here's my cam, and here's my intake lobe. I don't know, it's drawing lobes. Here's my exhaust lobe. It wouldn't be that far apart. It looks like Mickey Mouse. That's terrible. Okay, let's start over. This is bad. Let's do this. All right, so there and then there. Okay, and right here would be the peak lifts, and so let's say it's 110 LSA. So it's 110 crank degrees apart from peak lift points, right? That's your lobe separation angle. All right, now, intake centerline, let's say it is with TDC, right? Let's say it's dialed in at 110. And I have this kind of torque curve. And this kind of horsepower curve, okay? So here's our torque, here's our horsepower, okay? HP and torque. Make sure you can see that. Now somebody said, well, how come they're not crossing at 5,500 or 5,250? Guys, that's only for math, okay? There are engines that don't even turn 5,000 RPMs. So what are you going to say about that? Or if we're turning 9,000 RPMs, our torque is not peaking at 5,250, okay? So don't even think that way. Don't even worry about that number. It's only for math problems. Now getting back to this. So now what I want to do is I'm going to advance this cam instead of, this is my 110 LSA. And what I want to do is now advance it plus Oh my goodness, these stupid markers. Bunch of junk. Plus 2 degrees, okay? So now, no. We're gonna take a swing at it. Let's go 4 degrees. So here's gonna be my 106. Okay, so this is 106. Here we go. Okay, and 106 horsepower. This is your torque. 106 torque. 110 torque. Okay, now, just to give you an idea, this is the exact same cam. All I've done was advance it 4 degrees, and this is what happened. Okay? And that's provided the camshaft is the right one. Because if it's the wrong one, now hear me closely. If it's the wrong cam and I advance it, I could see massive power gains. If it's the really wrong cam and I advance it, I could see terrible power loss. Now, I'm not trying to blow your mind. I'm telling you things that's happened to me on the dyno. If this is the right cam, this is what I'm going to see is a subtle change. And every time I advance it, you know where the biggest gains are? The biggest gains when I advance a cam are below 4,500 RPM. Almost always. Well, I'm not racing down there. We are down there some. Let's say at the worst, tightest track, we might drop down to 3,800 RPMs. And on that same track, turn 85. Do you realize the challenge of that? But if you're a drag car, unless you're like, a lesser engine, 500 horse or something, you don't have a really big stall converter, this might help you launch, right? Every time I advance it, my gains are usually below 4,500. Unless the camshaft is wrong. I did one time on a 112, and I wasn't happy with it at all. I was sucking wind. I was like, man, this is not good. What have I done wrong here? And I advanced the cam 4 degrees, because at a belt drive it was really easy. And guys, it picked up, let me see, what was it? It picked up 28 horsepower. 29 horsepower, somewhere in there. Why? Because I didn't have the LSA right to start with. The lobe separation angle should have not been on 112 for that engine. But I've had other engines where the wider lobe separation was wonderful. But when you get one right and you advance it a few degrees, you're going to see a gain below 4,500. Usually, okay? This is generally speaking, okay? And if this is the wrong cam, you could see a massive increase in power. And you also could see a terrible decrease in power. And the same thing happens in the opposite way if I take it from 110 and go to 114. All these are going to change. The 114 is going to be possibly an absolute turd everywhere. Can you see that? It's a turd everywhere. And you know what? 6,000 RPMs. Why? Because it was the wrong deal from the start. You see this a lot when you're doing small, like what Richard Holdner did, for example. Not a race engine, not high compression, not a big cam, wasn't trying to set the world on fire, and all his cams had the same intake and exhaust duration, and he widened the LSA, and that when he got too wide, it was a turd everywhere. Did not make high RPM power. Now the one thing is, he stopped at 6,000, and I don't think this was nosing over, so that was not happening. I got a picture of it we can pull up. He just stopped, he just stopped at a certain RPM. I don't know that at 8,000 or 8,500 to 114 wouldn't have took over. It very well possibly could, but he didn't turn it that hard. So, you say, well, what does this have to do with the price of eggs in China, right? It has to do with this right here. This simple little word that so many people use today. And that word is called what? Trends. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that when you do things, you see trends. If I go in there and turn on my stove and watch the burner turn red and stick my finger on it, I'm going to burn my finger. Now, how many times do you think that would happen every time I lit the stove? Would you say that would be 100% of the time? Sure we would, and that would be a trend. In other words, every time Salter sticks his finger on a hot red stove element, he burns his finger. So the trend is, he burns his finger when he sticks it on a hot red stove element. Okay, that's a trend. It's also, the trend is that if you drive 75 miles an hour in a monsoon downpour, you're going to hydroplane. The trend is you're going to hydroplane because water gets between your tire and the road. And you literally start floating like a boat at 75 miles an hour. In which case, what happens? The trend is you normally wreck. So the trend is that when you do this with LSAs, this personality comes out of the engine. That is the trend. The other trend is every time I get a competitor's engine, the LSA is all tightened up together. And the trend is the customer tells me it runs great off the corner and then it falls on its face. That's a trend. And after 30 years of hearing these trends, you kind of start putting two and two together. And yet there might be some people that want to deny that, but the fact is a fact. You cannot deny the physical location of that lobe is different now. You cannot deny tight LSA, wide LSA. I know it looks weird, but that's what it is. That will have a physical effect on the engine. So if it's all about opening and closing, watch this right here. Let's say these lobes are 200 degrees at 50. No. We're going to make it 200 degrees at 6. Okay? Both of them. At 6 thousandths, right? So it's like right, that's basically what they used to call advertise. Like end to end of that lobe, the duration, total time, it's 200 degrees duration. All right? And because of that, and I'm just making up numbers here, because of that, my intake and closing numbers are such. And let's say the LSA is on 120. Okay, 120 LSA. Now, we're going to go over here, and this one opens at, I don't know, let's say this opens at, you know what? I'll actually get the numbers for you in a moment. And then we're going to take this one. This is also 200. This one's also 200. But it's on 104. Okay, so the LSA is 104 They're both 200 degrees duration. All right, hold tight. Let me get the actual numbers. Okay, so I got actual numbers up here, and this is lobe separation angle, and to show you the intake and exhaust opening and closing points. All right, so let's say we have a camshaft on 120 degrees of lobe separation angle. Excuse me, guys. Okay, these lobes are 200 degrees of total duration, and I've got at 6 thousandths. All right, so what would their intake valve opening would be? Negative 20, minus 20 degrees. Closing would be 40 degrees. Exhaust valve opening would be 40 degrees. Exhaust valve closing would be minus 20. Now let's take those same two exact cam lobes, tighten them to 104, okay? Look what happens. Instead of being minus 20, your intake valve opening now is minus 4. Exhaust intake valve closing is 24. Exhaust valve opening is 24. Exhaust valve closing is minus 4. It's not even in the same ballpark. Even though these two cam lobes are identical, what would it take to even get close to this number? You'd have to shrink the duration down to 168 degrees of duration, and that would put your intake valve opening back to minus 20 and exhaust valve closing back to minus 20, but your closing on the intake and opening on the exhaust, you're not going to get there. You cannot get there. You say, well, what point are you trying to make? I'm trying to tell you that it cannot all be done with just these numbers. It is a combination of getting it right with this correct spread and the duration. I can't get there because people say, well, you move, the LSA is only used to get the opening and closing. You can't, listen, there are some numbers. That's why I told you in video 1 that based on my experience, based on what personality I want to give the engine, I know what intake and exhaust lobes that are going to work for this deal. And then it's a matter of figuring out where to put them on the shaft. There is a physical difference that cannot be compensated for. That physical difference is how far apart they are. You cannot overcome the fact that no matter where they close, there is a difference between this gap as far as when it starts to open the exhaust lobe in comparison to the intake and this gap. You can't compensate for it. Guys, you can't physically compensate for it. That engine knows the difference between when it starts to open that exhaust here and when it does here. And it changes the personality of the engine. Now, the manufacturers know this, and so to get rid of EGR and all those vacuum lines and all those EGR solenoids that used to give so much trouble and the ports clogging up. By the way, I'll give you a little trick while I'm at it. If you've ever had a cylinder head with the EGR port clogged up, get you an emergency brake cable. Okay? Just like go to the junkyard or whatever, saw one off with a Ziz wheel. Like, you know how they got the little lead balls on one end to go into the brakes? Leave that end on, cut you about 1 foot with a Ziz wheel, and put it in a drill. And put that emergency brake cable in the drill, and push and frayed the end about that wide, and get it in that EGR port hole and spin it with a drill, and it will go right down every little nook and cranny of that EGR passage and clean it right out. And you can do it on the car. Just a little tip for you guys that have ever fought that. Anyways, you see the problem here. So that's why that whenever you do a cam comparison test and you see we got the same cam with different LSAs. That's why you see such a difference in the torque, especially the torque, because the torque shows up early because everybody's engine runs down there, 2, 3, and 4,000 RPMs. I mean, everybody's down there, right? Where you don't see the difference is at 6,000 and beyond, because they never pull that far. They always stop at 6,500, but if you were to continue pulling, especially in racing, you would see the trend would be that the little wider LSA would go on out further than the tight LSA. It will, and it doesn't matter who says it won't, it will, and you can prove it. Now, once you go too far, it's a turd everywhere, okay? Like I showed the 114 a while ago, it would just be junk everywhere. That's why I said in the first video, there's a window. Now, a 600 cubic inch big block with 14:1 compression does not want 102 LSA. Why? Because it's a trend. Do you know where we're running LSAs on engines like that? Now, I don't know how much experience some of these other YouTubers have, but I've built these engines that make 11 and 1200 naturally aspirated. And they're on 115, 117, 118, 119 LSA. Heck, guys, listen. I've got 300 cubic inch small block that turns 10,000 RPM, and the LSA is on 120. 120! Why? Because we're at, I think he launches at 8,800, and it turns almost 11,000 RPMs. LSA is on 120. Now, the bigger the engine, the more wider the LSA needs to be. But there's other things, like if I want high vacuum, I'm going to have a wide LSA. If I want clean emissions at idle, I'm going to have a wider LSA, because I've decreased my scavenging so much that you don't have that little misfire bobble when the intake and exhaust are open at the same time. The reason why the tighter LSA builds more torque early is because of scavenging. All right, but the wider LSA tends to have a little more cylinder pressure at higher RPMs. It gets complicated. You have to know why you're doing what you're doing, and everything is built for a purpose. All right, hang on one second. All right, so what I want to show you in this right here is right here is certain measured lift points. You got a 20 lift point, at 50 lift point, 200 lift point, and those are just ones that, you know, in the general industry gives out. You'll notice that in this picture, you got 322 crank degrees of duration at 20. You got 285 degrees of duration at 50, and at 200, 196 degrees of duration. In my earlier drawing on the board, I said what happens here and here and here, and there's other places that are extremely important. That is your lobe profile. And depending on these lobe profiles, that will also give you the characteristic of the engine's personality, how it's going to perform. So all of this has to be considered with longevity. Does the customer want any kind of noise? I mean, nobody wants noise, but with aggressive lobes, you're going to have more noise. And like I said, all of that has to do with where I put the lobe separation angle, because it just all depends on the personality of the engine that I want. What am I trying to achieve? Okay. All right, so another thing I want to point out is when you choose, the reason why I put so much emphasis on choosing the right intake and exhaust lobe is because let's look. What are we really? What is the reason we're picking a duration at all, right? Because some people will go off the cubic inch, and that's partly true, and some people go off compression, which is partly true. Some people go off the what's the RPM going to be at? That's also partly true. But what about like in my 396 video when the customer said, hey, I would like a lot of power, but I don't want any kind of thumpity, really radical cam. I want really good vacuum. I do not want to run a big aftermarket intake. I want to be able to close my stock hood with no cow induction. So, and I want to run 87 octane pump gas. So you're now, I think I set the compression at 9-to-1 on that thing. And I was able to get 571 horsepower. I showed you the dyno on it. What are our choices? What are we going by? Well, max and min RPM, right? Is that true? Well, kind of. Piston and valve clearance is an issue, but remember, it's probably an issue for people who aren't engine builders. I am an engine builder, so I can adjust for that. Idle quality is a big one. The low RPM is a big one. And the high RPM, obviously I'm trying to get the best of both of those. So when I choose a Lobe, the cubic inch compression ratio statically and the customer's desire as far as like what he wants from that engine are a big one. The bigger I make the duration, the longer the valve stays open, the more cylinder pressure I bleed off. That has to be known. But the longer I have the valve open, the more I'm hopefully able to draw in fuel and air, and the longer I'm able to get exhaust out. So they have a twofold positive and negative. Negative part is I'm bleeding off compression. Positive part is I'm pulling in air and fuel and I'm getting rid of the exhaust. So it's a balancing act, and that is why static compression has such an impact on where you start with. Obviously as well, what kind of RPM range are we talking about? Let's listen to Billy Godbold's own words right here.
The intake closing the lift, all this area under the curve, that's what you need to get when you're picking a camshaft. You have to know how much RPM that you're going to turn. You can't put something that's 218 at 50 and try to turn 10,000 RPM. Well, why? Well, the intake closing is way too early. It's slamming the door into the oncoming air. Well, let's see. Instead of talking so much about theory, let's go into and do an application you guys might be familiar with. If you talk to most guys who run sprint car and ask them do they run a 109 or 105 lobe separation camshaft and which one would be more responsive, everybody would say 105 would be more responsive. Well, why? Well, one thing we know for sure is the intake closing helps, but is that all? When you're on 105, that's going to close the intake 4 degrees sooner than if you're on 109. But we know that it's not just the intake closing because we could have got that with duration. We know that a smaller cam on a 109 with the same intake closing is not as good coming off the corners. So what's going on there? Well, the bigger 105 is better off the corners because it opens the intake sooner. Once you have a good header, the reflective exhaust wave that you get from exhaust opening is going to be reflected up the pipe, come into the chamber, and it creates a large pressure differential at intake opening.
Okay, you guys into a bunch of technical jargon, so hang on 1 second. Now, I wanted you to hear Billy Godbold say that because what did Billy just drive home to you, okay? Billy's driving home to you that LSA matters. There is a difference in cams from 105 to 109, or 109 to 112, or 112 to 114, that you can't get there just by changing intake and exhaust duration and moving it to a different LSA. They have a different running characteristic. It matters, guys. It absolutely matters. I'm not a cam grinder. I don't grind camshafts. Maybe if you are a cam grinder, or you have especially the new computerized CNCs, where you can basically type in anything you want and grind it. Doesn't mean it'll live, doesn't mean it'll make power, but it's grindable. You make it. Maybe you look at things slightly different, but for the professional engine builder, we don't have cam grinding machines, and don't really care that I don't need it. I have some of the best intake lobes on the planet at my disposal, and getting that right duration, intake and exhaust, and putting it on the right LSA is everything. And so for me, LSA is not just an input, but it's a tuning tool that I will use to develop the right cam to win races, to win money, to get sponsors, put food on the table, and to carry on, with your career. Somebody asked Richard Petty, out of all the cars he raced through the years, the Pontiac and, the Dodge and all them, which one did he prefer the best? And his exact response was the one that was on the car at the time. Meaning, he didn't care if it was a Pontiac or a Dodge. Whoever was writing the checks is who he liked. And the bottom line is, guys, we have to develop engines, we have to develop cams that win races. Now, I've seen videos where they talk about optimum this and that, and understand a race car, a high performance street or track or drag car engine is not running at 2,000 RPMs. Heck, 95% of them are not running at 4,000 RPMs, or they're just getting started. So all of the information where people stop doing their dyno pulls at 6,000 is irrelevant. Completely irrelevant in the racing world, because we're running from, say, 4,500 at some of the lowest places up to 9,000 plus. And that's where the experience with lobe separation angle really comes into play. I think it's very important that you remember that. Now, on the 396 video, part of my solution to what the guy requested was running a very small, very short intake duration with a much wider LSA. I put that thing on 115, and I normally would never have done that. And I did advance that one. I don't remember. I think I put it in 3 degrees advanced. I don't remember, but I have to go back and watch the video where I put it. But boy, did it turn out great. I couldn't have been happier. It had a really good sound, but not aggressive. Good vacuum, awesome power. And it made 571 with 100 pounds of oil pressure, which, by the way, that probably knocks 15 horsepower out of it. So it's just experience and knowing what to do, when to do it, and why you're doing it. So I'm going to close here to put things in perspective. This is my little friend, and he can be yours too, or it could be your worst enemy. And the worst part about your race car, a couple things you want to remember. This should be the last thing you do. You need to get your cylinder heads, your combination. Remember, an engine, it's an orchestra. All the instruments have to play together. And this is the very last thing that I choose. I ask a lot of questions. I try to figure out, everything about what they're trying to accomplish. And in the end, we hope to get it right the first time. And so I hope this information kind of gets your thought process going in the right direction. And thanks for watching. Appreciate it very much. Have a great day.